And I apologize, my live streaming is not working on my camera. I can record it locally and upload it later, but it's not being live streamed, so I apologize for that. All right. Any questions before we get started? No? Okay. I've put the link for the class notes into the chat, so you can all bring that up, please. All right. And I want to resume our discussion of covenants, which we started, it feels like a lifetime ago, before the midterm. And what I think is helpful is I created this little guide, which I called the Introduction to Servitudes. I'll put this link here as well. I tried as best as I humanly could to summarize what I think is the hardest topic of the semester. I don't think I succeeded. I did the best I could. It's still a hard topic. But if things still are not clicking after class today, I would encourage you to read through this document. It's about 5 or 6 pages. It's not very long, but I think it explains things in a cohesive fashion. All right. So the first thing I'd like to do is go over what was question number 8 from last class. I renumbered a question 1 just to make our lives easier, but it was numbered question 8. And this is a question designed to discuss horizontal privity. So take a look at question number, what I'm calling question number 1. Again, it was question 8 in the last session, but I just renumbered them. So here's your question. A and B are neighboring landowners and decide that they will mutually restrict their lots to single-family residential use. They sign an agreement where each promises on behalf of herself and her heirs that her lot will be used for single-family residential purposes only. This agreement is recorded in the county courthouse under the name of each signer. Are A and B in horizontal privity? True? Yes or no? Okay. Give you another 20 seconds on that one. A light attendance, only 47 people. Is there like a memo due for legal writing or something, or something else? Because there's very light attendance. Okay, I'll stop it there then. Whoever's next, please raise your hand. Someone's got to be next. Does no one remember? Naveen, thank you. Okay. So Naveen, let's just refresh the terminology. Mm-hmm. What does horizontal privity mean?
Horizontal privity means where the promisor and promisee have a relationship where an estate is conveyed.
Give me an example.
If A says, I promise to keep off your land, and then B agrees to that, they have horizontal privity. I don't know if that's the best example. But...
No, that's not even a example. What is horizontal privity? Just say it one more time. I think you said it right, but your example is not right at all.
Okay. It's basically where...
What's privity? Let's take a step back. What's privity?
Privity is just basically where two parties have a legal relationship.
Okay. What are the two kinds of privity that we've talked about in this class? There are two kinds.
We've talked about horizontal and vertical.
Well, before we got to horizontal and vertical, just within the law in general, what are two types of privity we've talked about?
Conveyances and contracts.
No. Let's see. Where are you? Who's next? I'm not. Sarah, are you here?
Yes.
Sarah, what are two types of privity that we've talked about? Forget horizontal and vertical, just in general. Two types of privity we've talked about.
Privity of estate
Very
and
good.
privity of contract.
Okay, very good. What is the difference between privity of estate and privity of contract?
Privity of estate is where you have a relationship that occurs through a land transfer.
Okay. What does that mean?
So there a promise is made when a servient estate is conveyed.
Excellent. That's actually a very good definition. I think I know where you got it from, but it's a very good definition, right? Thank you, Sarah. We have two types of privity that we have to talk about. Okay? Two types of privity we have to talk about. The easier one is privity of contract, right? Privity of contract. If I make an agreement with you to restrict land, that's enforceable. We have a privity based on a contract. But that doesn't work for creating a real covenant law. To create a real covenant law, you need what's called privity of estate. And to have privity of estate, it's necessary to transfer property while you're making the promise, right? That you promise to restrict land, and in the process you're transferring the property, right? So when you're conveying the servient estate, the promise is placed on the servient estate. Okay? Clay, you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Clay. Clay, let me ask you this question, please. What is horizontal privity then? That was a question put to Naveen a minute ago. Let's try it again. What's horizontal privity?
Well, according to the book, in this country, courts define privity of estate between landowners.
In your own words, not in your own words.
I'll be honest, I'm still kind of fuzzy on this concept together, but what I understand it to be is that when two parties that they both introduce a relationship together, there's not really a dominant or like submissive relationship. They've both done it together.
No.
I don't think I'm necessarily right.
No. Yancey, what's horizontal privity?
Hello?
Yeah, you hear Yancey?
Yeah, I'm here.
What's horizontal privity?
I think it's whenever you have privity of estate.
Ah, that is such a good answer. That's exactly right. So let's go to our question number 8. I'm sorry, question number 1. It was question number 8. I'm sorry. So let's look at question number 1 again. A and B mutually restrict the property. They each make a promise of how to use it. Is there privity of contract in this question?
No. Wait, yes, there's privity of contract.
Which one is it?
Yes.
Why is there privity of contract?
Because they each agreed to the covenant.
Right, they each agree to restrict their land. Now, the harder question, is there privity of estate here?
No, there's no privity of estate.
How come?
Because there's no property being conveyed.
Bingo, exactly right. The answer to number 1 is B, and about 66% of you got this one right. But I don't think you know why you got it right. Maybe you did, which is wonderful. But I want to make sure this is very clear for you. Because if you don't get this issue, the entire class will just make 0 sense. When we look at a covenant question, the very first thing you have to ask yourself, what is the relationship between the grantor and the grantee, right? At the outset, when the promise is made, what's the relationship between the grantor and the grantee? Are they in privity of estate or just privity of contract? If they're only in privity of contract, that is no lands being conveyed, it's a valid enforceable promise, but it's not enough to create a real covenant at law. To create a real covenant at law, you need horizontal privity. You need privity of estate. In your notes, just make it very clear. horizontal privity equals privity of estate, right? Horizontal privity equals privity of estate. And just drill that into your head. Students forget this without fail. They just forget the simple rule. They say, oh, yeah, they sold the land, therefore there's privity. No, it's privity of estate. And that's why I'm beating this point so hard, because I know in the past how students lose their way in these questions. At common law, privity of estate is the same thing as horizontal privity, right? The word horizontal privity isn't a real thing, right? That's not an actual legal doctrine. You won't find it in any statute or a case. It's just a way of explaining it that makes sense. But you need to know, for the covenant to be created, you need privity of estate. Okay. Questions? I don't believe you. I don't believe you. There's no questions. But if you're not going to raise your hand, I can't help you. Thank you, Allison. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm kind of confused in when like a covenant at law becomes more enforceable, if that makes sense. Like, it's like all I know is really like a contract. So like I have a contract back and forth, and so I'm just a little confused on like, how does it look different? I'm wanting a visual in my head.
Let's try question number 2. I think that'll clarify it. Okay? I promise. If I don't, Allison, come back to me and just you can raise your hand. I promise. Alexa, go ahead. Do you have a question as well?
When it comes to privity of estate, is there privity of estate when there's a landlord-tenant relationship, or is it just grantor-grantee?
Yes. And the reason why is, let's say that I'm your landlord and you're my tenant. I give you a lease with certain covenants, right? I say, you can't have loud music, you can't have, multiple tenants, right? Whatever. You're conveying the interest at the same time making the promises. So yes, in a landlord-tenant relationship, there would be privity of estate. That's correct. In fact, in England, you only had privity of estate in a landlord-tenant relationship. In America, you don't have that, but in the English courts, it was actually much more narrow. You don't think of a covenant when you have a lease, but you really do. Your entire lease is a series of things you can't do, right? You only can have one tenant, you can't have guests, you can't make loud noise, you can't paint the walls, all these stupid things in these leases. But these are all covenants, if you think about it. And they're enforceable. All right, everyone, let's take a look at number 2, please. And I think this will maybe help with Allison's question, maybe not, I don't know. Okay, so this is question number 2, which is a continuation from question number 1. And this is a question. Multiple choice. In our hypothetical, B sells her lot to C. And C builds an apartment house on his lot. Does the burden run from B to C? Yes or no? Another 10 seconds. All right. I just called on Yancy. Mercy here. Marissa? Marcos? No Marcos. Well, okay. Victor. Yeah, attendance is light today.
Yeah, hello.
Victor, is there some sort of like deadline that I'm not aware of that people are absent? Is there like a legal writing or some other?
No, not for me. So I'm not.
Okay, I appreciate your honesty. You're here, so I'm not blaming you. You're in class. Like I can't be mad at you. All right, so just refresh your memory, Victor. What does it mean when I say does the burden run from B to C? What am I getting at? What am I talking about there?
I would think like does the promise run from B to C?
What I mean, just in Define it without saying the word run. What does it mean? What does it mean for burden to run? Define it for me, please.
That the promise transfers
Good.
to the successor, which would be C.
Oh, I like that. The promise transfers to the successor. I like that. That's a good definition, Victor. Thank you. All right, so take a look. This is the diagram I gave you last week. And we'll keep going back to it over and over again. I just made it Amy, Bob, Diane, Carl to make it easier because I don't like ABC. But initially we have privity of estate or not privity of estate, right? We ask, is there horizontal privity? And in this case, a minute ago, the answer was no. That's 60% of you got this right? There's no horizontal privity. Then we learned that Bob conveys his interest to C, to Carl. And Carl builds an apartment complex. Okay? We ask, does the burden that Bob had, does the burden transfer to Carl? Right? Bob could not build an apartment complex. Can Carl build an apartment complex? Okay? Lisa, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. So Lisa, help us out here. In order for the burden to run to Carl, what needs to happen?
You need vertical and horizontal privity.
You need vertical and horizontal privity. That's exactly right. I'll get to vertical in a minute, but just refresh your recollection. Is there horizontal privity in this case?
No, because no
Yes.
land was conveyed.
Exactly. So at the outset, Lisa, if there's no horizontal privity, is there privity of estate?
No.
Correct. There's no privity of estate. Was there a real covenant law created here?
Yes. No.
What's the requirement for real covenant? What do you need?
You need a promise.
There are three requirements. There are three requirements for a real covenant law. Sarah says there's a midterm in PR today, so I'm skipping my class. Got it. Well, people.
The requirements are...
There are three requirements.
Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes.
That's okay.
So the covenant has to be touching or concerning the land.
That's one.
Intent to bind the successors.
That's two.
And privity of estate.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Elise. So I actually just packed a couple questions into her, so I apologize. I gave her too many different things, but I want to separate each element, right? When I'm asking you, does the burden run? What I'm asking you is whether they actually created a covenant. The mere fact that you make a promise doesn't mean you've actually created a real covenant, right? A covenant is a specific type of a promise. You have to touch certain bases. You have to do certain things. And there are three requirements. The first two are basically useless. They're almost always satisfied. And I don't want you to dwell on them very long. We'll talk about this in the Neponsit case later, but the first two elements are pretty easy. Do the parties intend to bind the successors? The answer is almost always yes, right? Usually when you create a covenant, it's not just for the two people living there, it's for their heirs and people who come later. So that's elements almost always going to be satisfied. The second element asks whether the promise touches and concerns the land. No one actually knows what this means. I'll just be honest, right? It's a meaningless phrase. It doesn't mean anything. And in the Neponsit case, it's like shrug emoji. We have no idea what this even means. So don't kill yourself on the second requirement. I mean, we'll talk about it, but it doesn't really matter. All the juice, right? All the power is in element number 3. Is there privity of estate? Specifically, is there horizontal privity? Right? That's the first question you need to ask yourself. Is there horizontal privity? Is there privity of estate? If there's no horizontal privity, you do not have a real covenant law. And if you do not have a real covenant law, the burden cannot run to successive purchasers. But if you do have privity of estate, and there is horizontal privity, then you've created a real covenant at law. That's not the end of the analysis. There's more stuff to do. But we ask ourselves, you need at the outset horizontal privity. And Lisa told us a minute ago that in question number 2, there's no horizontal privity. Right. So therefore, does the burden run? The answer is no. 80% of you got this one right. Very good. Okay, the answer here is no. In the absence of horizontal privity, you do not create a real covenant. And if you don't create a real covenant, the burden cannot run. So if B sells C the lot, and C builds an apartment building, C is not bound by the promise. Right? C says, look, at common law, I'm not bound. Not my problem. There's no real covenant at law. The burden does not run. Yes, Jenny.
Is this because B wasn't really bound by the promise to begin with?
B was. No, just be very careful. B was bound by privity of contract. You're allowed to be bound by privity of contract, but it doesn't transfer to successive buyers. That's why it's very important. If you go back to question number 1, B and C are in privity of contract. I think Naveen or someone else said that a few minutes ago, right? B and C are bound, and A and B were bound by that promise. And A can sue B on the contract, right? If B violates the contract, you can sue for breach of contract, just straight up breach of contract. But the question is, are future buyers, are successive owners bound by the promise? And that's where you need a real covenant law. In order to bind successive buyers, you need to create a covenant law. And in order to create a covenant law, you need horizontal privity at the outset. That make sense, Jenny?
Yes, I should have phrased that better. Since B was not burdened to begin with, that burden could not transfer.
Well, just be careful. B was burdened by the contract, but he was not burdened by covenant law. There's a difference.
That's what I mean, yes.
Okay, just be very careful. B had a burden because of the contract, but B was not subject to a real covenant law. There was no covenant law created. I see Chance. Allison, I want to come back to you because I sort of blew off your question a minute ago. Did that question number 2 clear a little bit up?
Yes. I guess my question is, how does, in this situation, C know that there is a covenant law? Is there something in the,
Oh, yeah.
Can I see that when the land was transferred?
Exactly. Because look, go back to the question number 1 I gave you, right? It says they sign an agreement and they record it in the county courthouse, right? So you would go to the courthouse and say, look, they made this agreement on, January 1st, whatever year, but there's no conveyance of the property associated with that, right? They each own Blackacre and Whiteacre, and they just made a promise. And you say, look, it's a contract, but it's not a real covenant law, so I can go ahead and build my apartment complex. There's no burden that runs to me. Right? You can be a savvy lawyer and say, look, there's no covenant here. I don't have to do this. It's not my problem. Okay. Yeah, okay. I got Chance, Giancarlo, and then Anthony in the queue.
Just basically real-world application. Say you're in a suburb and a bunch of people want to start a homeowners association. Is the real plan with that you all sign a contract and go, hey, look, you're signing a contract with the idea that once you sell your property, you're signing a contract that you're going to include that covenant, and that's how that kind of happens, and that's how you start that up. I'm trying to think about how this happens in the real world. So the contract would burden the person to create a covenant, which would burden the successive owner.
Chance, it's almost impossible to make a subdivision unless there's a single common owner. The way these usually work is like Neponsit, right? You have a single common owner who chops up his land into, let's say, 100 lots, and then he conveys each lot separately and places a covenant on each conveyance. That way, when every person buys it, the initial purchase, he has notice of this covenant, right? There's horizontal privity. And then once you create the horizontal privity, you can then authorize a real covenant law. That's what happened in Neponsit with the community in New York. Make sense?
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Giancarlo, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clear it up. So when there's a privity of contract, that obligation will never pass down to subsequent buyers.
No, if it's only privity of contract, it will not. The burden will not run. That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Right, privity of contract is fine. You can do it, but it's only valid between A and B in this case. Anthony, go ahead.
My question is, what type of, does it have to be like a full parcel of land, like a full estate to be conveyed in order for the covenant to be created, or what type?
This was a question I think Alexa asked me a few minutes ago. You can create a covenant with a lease, right? It's a leasehold. To create horizontal privity, you can convey less than fee simple. Maybe you give a life estate and you put a covenant on a life estate, which is fine. You can do that, right?
Okay.
But the key, and this is the key move, and it sounds so stupid, but I have to keep repeating it. You need to have the property conveyed with a promise. You can't just slap a promise on property that's already owned. Right? That's a common law rule. It's annoying and it actually made it very hard to create a covenant.
So like for the hypo, two neighbors could never create a covenant unless they're conveyed.
No, they only create a contract. And they can create a contract, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a contract. But you have to recognize that a contract will not bind successors. And generally the value of a covenant is that it's binding for successors.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Caitlin, go ahead.
I may have just misheard you just now, but did you say that if there's already a covenant in place, then two neighbors couldn't create a covenant at law? Is that what you said?
I don't think that's what I said. I said in order to create a covenant law, you need to have a transaction, but two neighbors can't just slap a covenant on their existing properties.
Okay. No, I see what you're saying.
Okay. All right. So we discussed in question number 2. I think most of you got this one right. The burden will not run from B to C because there's no horizontal privity. Nancy, go ahead.
I'm wondering if the neighbors do want to create horizontal privity. If one neighbor just conveys, let's say, a foot of land along the border, can they convey that?
No. The covenant must be on the entirety of Blackacre, right? If you only convey a 1 foot strip, that 1 foot strip is for residential purposes. It doesn't actually work. What they would, and this is Chance's question a few minutes ago. If two neighbors actually want to create a real covenant law, what they would have to do is insane. They would have to both convey their lots to a third party, and the third party would convey it back to them with the covenants on it. It's a straw man approach, which we talked about in the Church of Christ case, right? You would need to basically convey all the lots in the neighborhood to a single owner, and the single owner conveys it back to them with the covenants on it, which is insane. Just why would you do that? Why would you sell your house to someone for 5 minutes, risking it, right? So it's a very risky move, but at common law, you had to create these sort of straw transactions, which seemed like a waste of time. But that was the law. Does that make sense, Nancy?
Yeah, it makes total sense. The promise only applies to the exact terms.
Exactly. Perfect. Good. Well said. Anthony, go ahead.
Could they convey their houses to each other and create the covenant? And then
that's another way you can do it. A conveys his house to B and B conveys his house to A, and they just switch through right back. They can do that as well. I mean, can any of you guys imagine selling your house to your neighbor and just seeing what happens? I mean, just it's it seems like a lot of work, which is why these are generally performed with the subdivision, where you have a single common owner, which makes it a lot easier. Right? Like where I live, this was a huge plot of land back in the 70s. They just chopped up into little parcels, and every parcel had a covenant placed on it, and each successor who acquires the interest is now bound by the covenant. So, Chance says through contracts, all things are possible. Yes, everything is possible, just it's a lot of work, and then, it's complicated. All right, let's look at question number 3, please. This is a continuation from question number 1 again. In my hypothetical, A builds an apartment building. Can C sue A for damages? Can C sue A through damages? Okay. Who's next?
I think me.
Who's me? Oh, is that Blake?
Yep.
Okay, Blake. All right. So let's just take a look at this question for a second, all right? Before we were looking at whether the burden runs from B to C, right? This question is not asking about the burden. What is this question asking about?
It's asking whether or not A is still subject to their mutually restrictive covenant that they originally made with B.
Okay, so it's asking whether C is still subject to the covenant. What is it also asking? I'm sorry, whether A is... let me say again, I screwed it up. I anticipated my next question. It's asking whether A is still subject to the covenant, right? And what is it also asking?
Whether or not C has, I guess, standing to be able to sue A for violating that.
What do we call that? What do we call that?
Ooh.
What do we call it when C steps into the shoes of A?
When they step into the shoes of A?
I'm sorry, when C is able to sue A. What do we call that?
I don't know that I understand what you're getting at with this.
Let's look at the diagram for a second. Let me put the screen sharing on if I can. 1 second. All right, Blake, so, okay. Take a look at the diagram, right? Oops, wrong screen. So we have A, B, and C, right? I'm asking you, how can C sue A? This is the diagonal. What has to happen for C to sue A?
Do they have to have the vertical privity?
Oh, now you're going the right direction. Okay, keep going, keep going. You're on the right track. In order for C to sue A, what has to happen?
So in my mind, I see that A and B made the mutual promise to each other to not do things.
Correct.
B told to C.
Is A still bound by that promise?
A is still bound by the promise, yes.
Now, does C step into B's shoes?
Yeah, so it's like they can go across and still sue A.
Right. What's required for C to step into B's shoes?
The bundle of sticks.
I think you gave me the right answer. What do you mean by the bundle of sticks?
They have to have... It's in my notes. I said bundle of sticks because I read it a minute ago.
You're on the right track. I know where you're going with this.
They have to have the fee symbol from B.
Okay.
So any sticks that are attached, like a promise,
All right.
still go to C.
All right. Let me help out with this. Thank you so much for that, Blake. You're like 80% of the way there. So you're almost there. Let me just fill the remaining gap. Okay. Okay. So let's take a look at this diagram. This diagram gives a sort of simple example where there's one side that's burdened and one side that's a benefit, right? The left side has the benefit and the right side has the burden. Everyone make sense? Okay. But the more common example, and that's why I'm giving you this question, is not one side benefit, one side burden. The more common example is a mutually restrictive covenant, like in Neponsit, where each property is simultaneously burdened and benefited. Let me say it again. When you have a mutually restrictive covenant, both sides are simultaneously burdened and benefit. How does that work? Well, I can't build an apartment complex on my land, burden, but my neighbor can't either. That's my benefit, right? I have the benefit of having a clean, quiet neighborhood, but I also have the burden of not being able to build an apartment complex on my property. So each side of the chart is simultaneously burdened and benefited. And this is why students, they have such a hard time with this. And I get it. It's not easy, right? Now someone's going to ask, Josh, how do I draw in my notes a diagram that's mutually restrictive covenant, like it's going to look insane, right? This is a pretty picture because it's very neat. But when you have it with both burden and benefit on each side, it's like a 4-dimensional diagram. It just sort of pops out, right? It's hard to even visualize, which is why I'm giving you this question here in class to try to help you think about it. The Neponsit case is an example of where it's mutually restrictive. So this is actually realistically what you'll probably see in the world, right? In my subdivision, every property is one family home, which means it's a burden. And every property is also a benefit. I don't have to have a lot of noise in my neighborhood. Everyone's just one family, right? It's quiet.
So can I still ask you a question?
Yeah, Blake, of course. You're still on call. Go for it.
I didn't realize that was what you were getting at, because I have the benefit burden aspect in there. But in our discussions about covenants, I had that it was a mutually restrictive covenant between A and B. But is it technically a covenant?
It's not a covenant law because the burden cannot run. There's no horizontal privity. But I'm not done with this question yet, Blake. Though I'm actually. You can come back to you. Or do you want me to go to someone else? Your call. I don't care.
You can come back to me. I'm enjoying this one.
Oh, bless you. You're the only one, baby. Right? So let's go back to question number, let's say question 3. Okay, so we have A goes ahead and builds the apartment complex. And then we ask, can C sue A for damages? Right? So on this diagram, B and C are on the burden side. But now I'm not asking about B and C on the burden side, I'm flipping it. Right? I'm asking B and C on the benefit side. In order for the benefit to run from B to C, Blake, what has to be present?
You have to have that vertical privity.
No. Very close, though. In what circumstances do you need vertical privity? And I apologize. I skipped Chance. I'll come back to him in the next question. This was not deliberate.
Oh, sorry, Chance.
Yeah. I promise, Chance. I'll come back to you.
So for the burden to run, you need both the horizontal and vertical.
Yes. For the burden to run, you need both horizontal and vertical. Right? And remind us, Blake, what's vertical privity? You said it a minute ago with the bundle of sticks.
Fee simple.
Not necessarily. Yeah, okay, you've had enough. Chance, what's you did more than enough. Thank you, Blake. Chance, help us out here. What's vertical privity?
Vertical privity is between the original and successors, but adverse possessors do not get that.
You're giving me something that's correct, but as a general matter, what does it mean for B and C to be in vertical privity? Just in general.
The bundle of sticks was conveyed, the burdens and the privileges.
Right. So if I have a fee simple and I sell Chance a fee simple, are we in are we in vertical privity?
Yes.
Okay. Let's say, Chance, I have a fee simple and I give you a life estate. Are you and I in vertical privity?
No, because you still have an interest.
That's right. Okay. You
still have an interest, then the benefit can run, but for you have to have vertical and horizontal.
Oh, good. You just answered my next question. Let me just make it clear for everyone. You did exactly the right thing, Chance. In order for the burden to run, you need horizontal and vertical privity. Do you need vertical privity for the benefit to run, Chance?
No.
No. Do you need horizontal privity for the benefit to run? No. That's exactly right. Let's go back to our chart. Thank you, Chance. And you redeemed yourself. I skipped over you, but I apologize for that. Most people usually don't volunteer when I skip them, but I do appreciate it. In our question number 3, we're not asking whether the burden runs. We only care about the burden running if you're on the burden side of the chart. But now we're on the benefit side of the chart. When you're on the benefit side of the chart, you don't need vertical privity. You don't need horizontal privity. All you need is for A to C to convey some interest. It could be a fee simple, it could be a life estate, it could be a lease, whatever it happens to be. If A and C have some sort of relationship, then the benefit runs. And if the benefit runs, like this, up and down, C can sue A. Okay. Now, I want you to take a look at the diagram that's in your book, which is something I complained about. And I told the publisher this, and he said he'll make changes for the next edition. You have the burden side and the benefit side. On the burden side, they label it vertical privity. I think that's correct. Then they also label the benefit side vertical privity. You see, I put a red line through it right there. In your book, I think it's on page 838. Just cross out vertical privity on that side. And the reason why I ask you to cross it out is it's confusing. The word vertical privity should not have two meanings on different sides of the chart, right? I think it's very confusing to tell students, this is vertical privity for the burden side, and this is vertical privity for the benefit side. I think it's too confusing. So I would just say A and D share some interest. Okay. Questions? Go ahead, Haley.
Okay, so on the burden side for vertical privity, you have to convey the entire interest. If all I have is a fee simple, is that satisfied?
By definition, if you get a fee simple...
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not a fee simple, a life estate, yeah.
If B only has a life estate,
right,
and he conveys his life estate to C, then yes, that's enough, right? It's whatever you have, that's what you have to convey. The reason why is there has to be nothing left over, no future interest, everything's left over, no reversion, no remainder, nothing.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Because in this example, let me just make this point to Haley's question. If there's no vertical privity, the burden remains with B. And it's sort of perverse. If C builds a factory, A can then sue B for damages. Because imagine there's a landlord, right? Imagine B has fee simple, and he gives a lease to C. And then the tenant screws up and builds a factory, right? You don't sue the tenant, you sue the landlord, because he's bound by the covenant. Yeah, Allison, go ahead.
So I'm so confused because it's a mutual restriction. So how does
But there's
have a burden and a benefit?
That's right. In order to create a real covenant law, you need horizontal privity. They did not do that here. But you do not need that to create a benefit that runs, right? Benefits run even if there's no real covenant law. That's the sort of wrinkle, right? The benefit runs from down the benefit line, even in the absence of real covenant law. Why?
So could it say...
Let me finish the thought. Why? Because A and B promised to bound by this restriction, right? A is promised. And A doesn't get out of that promise if B walks away, right? A is still bound by the promise. And you're basically suing on the original promise, right? In this example, C steps into B's shoes and sues for damages. So it's not unfair to A. A agreed to this promise. He should live by it. But the successive buyer was not bound by that promise. And it's only by running the burden, not running the benefit, that this matters. That make sense, Allison?
Yes.
It's hard. This is I'll be candid. I see all the hands in the queue. I'll get you guys in a second. This is probably the hardest topic the entire semester. I freely concede that, right? The law wants to make it easy for benefits to run. The law wants to make it hard for burdens to run, right? In this example, question number 3, A promised to limit the land to residential. That's a promise A made. It doesn't matter if someone else moves on to the other lot. A is still bound by his promise. That's question 3. But in question 2, B made the promise, but C never did. And it's considered unfair to require C to be subject to a promise that he never agreed to. So it's fair to bind the original promisor, A, but it's unfair to bind the successive promisee. In this case, we C.
So C can sue A because
Correct.
he has
Yes.
the benefit.
But A cannot sue C. Like I said, let me repeat what Allison said. I think that was actually very good. A can sue C because the benefit runs. I'm sorry, I screwed up. C can sue A, right? C can sue A because the benefit runs. But A cannot sue C because the burden does not run. One more time, okay? C, and let me do this in the diagram so it's not so abstract. If I had a board in the room, this would be so much easier because I can just point, but I have to do a stupid screen share. C can sue A, right? Carl can sue Amy because the benefit runs. But Amy cannot sue Carl because the burden does not run, right? The benefit runs so Carl can sue Amy, but Amy cannot sue Carl, the burden does not run. So you have to be very careful which side of the fence you're looking on. Are you on the burden side or the benefit side? It makes a huge difference. Allison, is that closer? I see a thumbs up. I'm happy to see that. Okay, who's up next in the queue? Nick?
Yeah, so just kind of expanding on that. Let's say A and C both desire to build an apartment complex.
Okay.
The burden doesn't run to C. Therefore, C can build an apartment complex, but A cannot because the benefit runs to C,
Correct.
but the burden does not. So does that create a situation where C can basically build an apartment complex and then prevent A from ever building one as well?
Well, keep in mind, Nick, that even though C is not bound by the covenant, B is. And A could sue B for damages.
Okay.
And then in turn, it's not clear that B could recover against C. So it would be tricky, yeah. If you don't create a valid real covenant law, you can't complain when successive buyers screw up. Yeah, but that's right.
So then A would pursue B for its remedy.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And then, I guess on the term mutually restriction or mutually restrictive, does that usually denote a subdivision?
Usually. It doesn't have to, but usually. Usually.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Nick. I see Alan has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, you just kind of confused me.
Oh, no. I was doing so well before.
Yeah, I was following along, but then when you said that if C builds an apartment complex and the burden doesn't run to him,
right,
it goes to B.
No, but
for
B,
C building an apartment complex.
Well, B can be sued, right? Because he's still bound. In other words, okay, let me say it like this. The hypothetical we had before is, let's say that C was a tenant and B was a landlord, right? Right? If B still has the fee simple and C is a mere tenant, right? Then you would sue the landlord.
Okay.
Right. I think that was an example someone asked me a minute ago, right?
Okay, can I give you another example?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So say that B has a life estate, for example, and he conveys to C a life estate.
Okay, then he's out of the picture. He's out of the picture. Yeah, no.
A can then go back and see
correct.
B.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's right. If the full bundle 6 is conveyed, then B has nothing to do with the land. The example I think I was asking about was if B is, say, the landlord and C is a tenant and they build a factory on it or an apartment complex. I'm sorry, that was not clear. So you were right to be confused. So you're paying very close attention.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is not easy. I'm going to, if you look at the chat, I have questions numbers. Hold on, what numbers are they? We did 1, 2, and 3. Questions 4 through 8. I'll do those next class. I don't have time for them right now. So if you want to try to get a jump ahead and work with your study groups, try and work out questions 4 through 8 for next class. I start those for next class. I'll come back to it. But I want to have time to do our 2 cases today: Tulk, Moxhay, and Neponsit, which are not easy. Any other questions on these first? Look, we spent 50 minutes on 3 questions. Just that's how hard this topic is. Which is, I get it, I understand. Adam, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering. I think what you went through with Allison helped me clear stuff up a little bit. But is there any, I guess, more so policy reason just for myself to hear as to why we want the ease of the benefit to run versus the burden?
Yeah. The reason why is that burdens are, part of the phrase, very burdensome, right? They're very onerous. They put a lot of requirements on people, and the courts don't want people to restrict their fee simples unless they absolutely have to, right? The idea is a fee simple absolute is a very important, interest, and when you put a covenant, you're taking 6 out of the bundle, and to take 6 out of the bundle, you want to have a very clear statement. You want to have very clear notice to everyone that there's a burden that's running. With the benefit, it doesn't modify someone's fee simple, right? You can have a fee simple and just have this additional benefit of your neighbors being, one-family houses. So you're exactly right, Ad. The law made it a lot easier for the benefits to run down and a lot harder for the burdens to run down. That's the way the law developed.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else in these 2 seriously, we spent 2 full classes on basically 3 or 4 questions. This is fine. It happens to me every year. This is like the future interests of Property 1, right? Property 1 is like future interests. Property 2 is like covenants. I think like the most obtuse part of the entire semester. I'm used to it. I'm happy to spend as much time as we need on this topic because it's confusing. Caitlin, go ahead.
I just want to make sure, so we are still only talking about common law. We haven't even gotten to the restatement where they're connected. Okay.
Yeah, you saw my thunder. Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. All of these awful rules that we're talking about now are common law rules. The modern approach, the restatement the third restatement, has basically eliminated all of these rules. If you go to that document I sent, Introduction to Servitudes, of the sections, and Roman numeral 3 is the modern approach. The modern approach is so easy, it's stupid. Okay? In the modern approach, you don't need horizontal privity. You don't need vertical privity. The burden runs no matter what estate you convey. That's it. The burden always runs. So basically, if neighbors create a covenant that's mutually restrictive under the third restatement, that's good enough, right? All of this stuff we're talking about doesn't matter. Now, don't get so excited. States haven't actually adopted the third restatement. Texas and other states are still using common law rules, so you have to use a common law. I can tell you on this topic, I will not test you on the modern approach because it's so stupidly easy. The answer is yes, of course a burden runs, you idiot. There's a covenant, right? That's the answer. And so there's nothing for me to test you on there. So I will test you on the common law approach. I'm sorry. That's the actual one that you have to know in the state of Texas, and also in there's stuff you have to learn. Yeah, that's so easy. Thanks, Anthony. Exactly. Yeah, it's painfully easy, the common law, the third restatement approach. They basically said, yeah, we'll get rid of everything. We'll just make it automatic. If you want to restrict property, just make sure there's notice, and that's really all you need. All right. Any other questions on these diagrams? I do want to talk about the other 2 cases for today. All right. So far, we've been talking about real covenants at law. Real covenants at law. And when you see the phrase at law, that doesn't probably mean much to you, but it was very significant in England. Because in England, you had 2 separate court systems, right? You had the courts of law, the common law courts, and then the courts of equity, or also called courts of chancery. I can give an entire semester on the difference between law and equity. I'm not going to do that here. But for your purposes, what mattered significantly was the remedy. In a court of law, the remedy would usually be damages. Think of a breach of contract action, right? Or a tort, right? The remedy for a court of law violation is a damage suit. So if someone violated a real covenant law, you would generally get damages, generally. But in a court of equity, the remedy was different. In a court of equity, the remedy is usually an injunction. Stop doing this, right? Don't do this. Don't build that factory. Just don't build the 2-family home. Now, I'll cut to the chase. In modern times, none of this matters anymore because courts have merged law and equity, right? Think of a case like Boomer, the cement mixing case, where the court says, well, we can do an equity remedy, we can do an injunction, we can do damages, well, whatever. So again, this was Caitlin's question a minute ago. None of this matters for the modern approach. In the modern approach, the type of remedy is not very important, right? And here, all states have basically, not all states, I think 46 states have merged law and equity, so it doesn't really matter. But at common law, you would have different remedies to be sought. If it was an equitable action, you get injunction. If it was a law action, you get damages. Okay. Why does this matter? Well, we have real covenants at law. And a real covenant law requires privity of estate, right? That's the third requirement. But the equity courts created another type of servitude. And it was developed over the course of many years, right? It was called an equitable servitude. An equitable servitude. Okay? An equitable servitude. You had a real covenant law. Those were enforced in the law courts. And you had an equitable servitude, which was enforced in a court of equity. The real covenant law required the 3 elements we talked about, with horizontal privity, the privity of estate. Equitable servitudes also have 3 elements. The first 2 are the same, right? There must be intent to bind successors, and they have to touch and concern the land. But the big distinction between the real covenant law and the equitable servitude is the third element. To create an equitable servitude, you do not need privity of estate. Let me say that one more time. To create to create an equitable servitude, you do not need privity of estate. It's a lot easier. All you need is notice. Notice. The successive buyer must have notice of the promise. And if the successive buyer has notice of the promise, you can enforce the promise through an injunction in an equitable servitude. Let's say that again. If the successive buyer has notice of the promise, you can enforce the promise through an injunction with an equitable servitude. Now, what does this mean? In any exam question I ask you, let's say, there's no privity of estate, there's no horizontal privity. That is not the end of the question. Even if you can't enforce the promise as a real covenant law, you might be able to enforce the promise as an equitable servitude. Let me repeat that. Even if you don't have horizontal privity, right, you cannot enforce the covenant at law. The promise might be enforceable in equity through an equitable servitude. So on any exam question I give you, you always have to think both types of servitudes. Is there, number 1, a real covenant law? And number 2, is there an equitable servitude? I won't ask you, I might, but I don't have to ask you that. I can just say, is this promise enforceable? Right? I can just say, is this promise enforceable? Right? I can put that in a question. It's a fair question, I think. And you say, well, number 1, it doesn't meet the requirements of real covenant law, but there was notice, and you can enforce this in equity and seek an injunction. And it's a perfect answer. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Right? I want to see you actually jump through those steps. Again, the first 2 elements remain the same. There's intent and touch and concern. So those are basically automatic. I mean, you can just say that, but they're automatic. The magic, though, is whether you have horizontal privity, privity of estate. If you don't, ask yourself, is there notice? And then the courts can enforce it. So, Alan or someone asked, isn't it really, oh no, sorry, it's Adam. Isn't it really hard to create a real covenant law? Oh yeah, it's tough. But it's easier to create equitable servitude. You can't get damages being an injunction, which in many cases is just enough. What do you need? Jenny, go ahead.
Is it either actual or constructive notice?
Oh, I love that question. Generally, you need actual notice, although I don't want to say that's a blanket rule. I'm just going to assume there are some cases where constructive notice is enough. I think the Sanborn v. McLean case for next, actually I put it for Monday, I guess, is a case where constructive notice may be enough. So the general rule is I think actual notice is what you need, but if you're in a subdivision where everyone's in a one-family home and then you decide to build a gas station, maybe you should know something goes up. So I think that's the general rule. Like there's an exception to every rule, of course. All right, so let's talk about Tulk v. Moxhay. Again, I don't have time to do the cases as close as I'd like to because I want to do all the questions. So read the case summary. It's in the case summary folder later. But in Tulk, you had a promise made for a garden, that a garden would remain as a garden and wouldn't be used for commercial purposes, whatever. In this case, there was no horizontal privity. There was no privity of estate. In England, they have very funny rules. They can't create it in this case, which is not relevant. But the court says, well, even though there's no privity, that is, there's no real covenant law, we're a court of equity. And we're still going to enforce the promise. Why? It's not fair, right? Moxhay purchased this land with knowledge of the promise. Right? He bought it knowing there was a restriction on it. He had notice. And when you buy land with a restriction that's on it, you take it subject to the covenant. Right? You purchase it for a lower price, right? You say, okay, I'm not getting the full bundle of sticks. I'm getting most of the sticks, not the full bundle. And you take it with that knowledge. And it will be unfair to let him benefit after having knowledge, right? The courts don't like people who cheat. So therefore, the court enforced the promise as a matter of equity. And he could not build on the lot. The phrase equitable servitude doesn't appear in the opinion because the doctrine hadn't been developed yet. This was development over the course of years. But this is what's called an equitable servitude. So again, you have real covenants at law, which lead to damages. And you have equitable servitude, which yields injunctions. With a real covenant law, you need privity of estate. And with a, an equitable servitude, you just need notice, right? So there's so many categories, things that to keep track. I did my best with the introduction servitudes. If it needs work, tell me. I'll be happy to improve it. But it's hard to keep this straight in your notes. There's just so many left and right turns. It zigs and zags a lot. Okay. Questions? I don't believe you. This is hard. This is not easy. Questions? Anything? Yes, go ahead, Nick.
So in our example questions that we started off with, would A be able to sue for an injunction against C because they recorded their...
I think so. Yeah, I think so. So go back to question number 1. Actually, question number 2. I think that A could sue C for an injunction to block the construction of the apartment complex. I think that's exactly right. Precisely because they had notice. It was recorded. This thing, Jenny asked actual constructive. There's actual notice that's recorded here. So even if you can't enforce something as a covenant law, you can still seek a real covenant. You can still seek an injunction. Which for some people, frankly, the injunction is more valuable than the damages. I think that's more people even want the injunction than the damages. A good question. Caitlin, go ahead.
Is it possible? So I'm thinking for on the exam and in real life. So first on the exam, would we analyze both? Would we analyze a fact pattern under both and go through the elements for each and then decide that way, or would we just look at the fact pattern and be like, okay, this is definitely an equitable servitude, so we can just quickly say, well, it's not because they're
I think, let me put it this way: if you have a real covenant law, it's always going to also be enforceable as an equitable servitude. In other words, if you have horizontal privity, by definition, you'll have notice. So it's kind of redundant. If you find this real covenant, I guess you could also say there's, for the same reasons, there's equitable servitude, but it's not really needed. Where it really matters if the step one is there's no real covenant because there's no privity, but there is an equitable servitude. That's the where it really comes into play. But if you wanted to, I guess you could just say the three requirements are met for real covenant law, and the three requirements also meant for equitable servitude. You can do that.
Okay, and then my other question is just, can someone in real life actually recover both damages for the real covenant and also an injunction?
Yes. You can. In American states, I think in 47 states, they've merged law and equity courts. So you can bring a single suit that seeks both damages and injunction. Absolutely.
And you can recover both. If you
Think of Boomer, though. The courts don't always like injunctions, so the courts may just award damages, and that's enough.
Okay.
Mackenzie, go ahead.
So in Tulk v. Moxhay, wasn't there horizontal privity between
in America there would be, but in England, this was, I think, Alexa's question an hour ago. In England, you only have horizontal privity if in a landlord-tenant relationship. It's sort of a weird thing. In America, there absolutely would be. In American court, this would have been a fully enforceable real covenant law, but in English courts, it would not. That's something that confuses students, which is why I made a little note about this in the study guide for the case.
Okay, yeah, I forgot about that, so I was confused.
That's okay. Thank you, Mackenzie. All right. We have about 2 minutes left. Let me briefly talk about the Neponsit case. I hate that case. It's so poorly written. Every year I read it, I'm like, oh, God, these judges with the torturing law students. I can summarize actually very quickly. There are requirements to create a real covenant law. The parties must intend to bind their successors, number one. The promise must touch and concern the land, number two. And number three, must be privity. In this case, there was an intent, right, that the single owner wanted to bind successors. That was easy. What does touch and concern mean? The court goes through this long, painful discussion. They say, well, it doesn't really mean anything, so we don't care, right? If a restriction affects the value of the land, it touches and concerns the land. And that's what the modern rule is, right? Any restriction touches and concerns the land. So basically, it's satisfied automatically, right? Every restriction is going to touch and concern. There might be some fringe one that doesn't, but what the court's saying is we're not going to get involved. The third issue is sort of obscure. Can you have horizontal privity with a corporation, a third party, a property owner association, right? The HOA doesn't own the property, but can they have the benefit? The court says yes. So all of this case basically leads to a very simple conclusion. Any promise will be enforceable at law, right? If there's an intent to bind successors, it doesn't matter if it touches the concerns. It doesn't matter if you meet the strict requirements of privity. We are going to enforce it, right? It's a very strange holding, a very strange case. I encourage you to read maybe a couple page summary about it. I encourage you to read it. I think that'll bring it to focus, but it's just a very complex case that just is, I always say don't assign it, but then you should assign it because it's useful to know. Okay. Questions? And I've started the minute poll so you can start at your answers now. Whereas I'm out of time, but I think this was a very useful class. Okay. Anything? All right. We'll resume those questions. Questions, I think it's 4 through 8 next week. And if you have any questions, let me know. I still haven't gotten your midterms yet. I'm actually getting annoyed. The registrar has not sent them yet. I don't know why, but I keep asking. But anyway, thank you all so much. Office hours around 12:30. Thank you.